Don't get excited. The shop was closed. I went and they were on holiday. Hello. All right, we're here. We're there.
Well, how bad can it be? Right. Sort my versions.
30 degrees, 7 consecutive days, 9th month, 2023. Welcome on behalf of St Mary's Halesworth PCC. We are the current guardians of this place of energy, alignment and worship that in recent times, that is at least since the 11th century, has stood for Christian concepts of the Creator, creation and creativity. This weekend, we are proud to be collaborating with Halesworth Town Council's Area Sustainable Hub for this climate conference. A reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. If you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. A quote from Gus Speth. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists, he writes, don't know how to do that. The Anglican Communion has 5 marks of mission: to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. Our local community motto, church motto, is very well expressed by what you see around you this evening. Community in church and church in community. Some notices and guidance for this evening. We have to recognise that there are some here who believe in offshore oil, and some who don't want onshore nuclear. Some present are against offshore wind, others against onshore solar. If there is no one easy question to frame the challenge we meet to discuss, there is certainly no single simple answer. So may I urge us not to copy those models we have available to us that mock and deride the person, but rather may we focus on learning from each other's diverse views on the matter in hand. We hope that this sacred place of hospitality and sanctuary will enable us to engage to disagree well. We may like to think before we speak. Is what we are bound to say true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and kind? Before I conclude my welcome and introduction with a short prayer written by the Pope, I would just like to let you know that in the case of our needing to leave the building, there are doors at the back for the majority of us. You may like to leave if you're on the panel from the door behind you, which we came in through. There are toilets, accessible toilet, temporary toilet just at the bottom of the tower or across the marketplace. And if we do need to leave, we're gathering in the marketplace to let everybody know that we are safe. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out on us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it. That we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognise that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. It's my great pleasure to hand over to the Right Reverend Martin Seeley, Bishop of Edmundsbury and Ipswich, to lead us through our proceedings this evening.
Dominic, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honour to be in this particular role of chairing this very august panel. And there is a process which I will explain in a moment. But first of all, what I would like to do is just thank and commend the organisers for putting on this conference. The whole 3-day, and there's been apparently an exhibition for 10 days prior, an amazing enterprise to put on all sorts of events, and we all know that that involves a great deal of work, and I'm hugely grateful to everybody who's been involved in that. I want to name 2 particular people who are Rachel Kellett. Rachel, you will know if you are here from Halesworth because she's a town councillor, but you may know particularly because she led the campaign to save Halton Pits, the successful campaign to save Halton Pits. So thank you, Rachel. And I want to thank the Reverend Jenny Williams, who's on the staff in this benefice, Team Vicar here. She is the co-organiser with Rachel and has done a huge amount of work in pulling together this panel, amongst other things, and a variety of other activities. So let's thank Jenny too. And to thank the town council who are supporting this whole conference, the whole, all of the range of activities, for their commitment to this. So let's give a round of applause to the town council. And I know we're grateful to St Mary's, to Dominic, and for the church council here and all the staff and volunteers here in the church for enabling us to meet in this place. One of the events that has been taking place has been a gathering for children. So 100 children apparently have passed through the hands of Alison Alder, who's been working with them. And one of the things they did was to put some hopes up on, wrote them on cards and then hung them on a tree. And we've taken a few off, and I'm just going to read them out, just to give a bit of context. What are the children thinking about? These are primary school children. I hope that swifts and hedgehogs come back to Halton. I hope that the icebergs don't melt. I hope that lots more forests don't get chopped down and more nature is going to grow everywhere. And I wish that no one puts rubbish in the oceans because turtles think plastic bags are jellyfish. They eat them and they die. So, people were invited to submit questions. Out of that, a team, not myself, but a team of people have distilled questions from that. And so we've got, and they're set questions. So the questions are already asked. There's not questions from the floor, and you appreciate why that's so. And what I'm going to do first is just to ask each member of the panel to introduce themselves reasonably briefly. And then there's the first question, which I'm going to ask all the panel to answer. It's a very brief question, or very brief answer. And then we'll work through the questions. And we've identified 2 or 3 people who will respond to the question, but others from the panel may feel they want to chip in the light of what they've heard. So that's the process that we will go through. So, if we start over on the far left.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Rout. I'm the Deputy Leader of Suffolk County Council and the Cabinet Member for Finance and Environment. And I'd just like to say that I think bringing those 2 roles together, both finance and environment, was a key decision made by the Leader of the Council, Matthew Hicks. I think it's particularly apt because all too often we think of the issues in isolation. But by bringing them together, we're able to address how answering so many of those important environmental questions enable us to better balance our budget and deliver savings to the taxpayer.
Good evening, everybody. Great to see such a big turnout for tonight's event. I'm Adrian Ramsey. I'm co-leader of the Green Party across England and Wales. And at the next general election, I'm standing to be Member of Parliament for the new Waveney Valley constituency, which, amongst other areas, I'm pleased to say includes Halesworth and Bungay and the surrounding villages.
Hello, I'm Thérèse Coffey. I'm Member of Parliament for Suffolk Coastal and I'm Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Catherine Rowett. I used to be the Green Party Member of the European Parliament for this area very briefly before Brexit. And then now I am the County Councillor for West Deptford in Norfolk, one of 4 Green Party county councillors in Norfolk.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's David Kemp, and I'm the Environment Agency's Coastal Team Leader for Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, the Eastern Front of climate change.
Hello, I'm Josiah Meldrum, and I'm co-founder of a business called Hodmedot, and we work with farmers to increase diversity on their farms in the crops that they grow in order to address some of the issues that I'm sure we'll be discussing this evening. And lastly, I hope I'm not Peter Dobson. No, I'm Darren Tansley. I've stepped in at the last minute for Peter. I'm the Protected Species and Wild Rivers Manager at Essex Wildlife Trust, but also chair the UK Waterfowl Steering Group. You may have seen me sloping in rather late because I've been standing on a riverbank with farmers discussing climate change and rivers and connectivity, so many apologies for being slightly late.
So you can see we have this incredibly rich, gifted panel with huge experience, and we look forward to what they have to say in response to the various questions that I've been given here. The first question, which I'm going to ask all of them to respond to, is when did you personally realise that we were facing a climate emergency? And I'm going to follow in the same order that we started, so Richard.
Thank you, Bishop. I think it's difficult to say when one first thought we were facing a climate emergency, but I think for me, realising that a changing climate was a major issue has been a growing sense throughout my life. I grew up in a farming family. My grandfather would always keep weather records from the field at the top of the garden, and he would say to me, things are changing, it's different. And that was back in the early 90s. And my uncle, he continued that process as well. And you could see, just on a very basic level, how it was impacting on farming in a rural community. And then, as I grew older and travelled overseas, and you do simple things in small villages, speak to fishermen, and they'd say that the weather's never normally like this. It was perfectly dry in the middle of October when it was normally pouring with rain. So you saw this growing sense, this acceptance that climate was changing and that we needed to do something about it. So for me, there wasn't this one revelation that told me the climate was a major issue. I think it's a growing sense of awareness over the course of my life, and I think it's something that in recent years, rightly, has come to the fore.
There's a
Thank you,
problem
Richard.
with people hearing.
Can you hear? No. Okay.
Is that mic actually working?
Is the mic on?
Yes, it is on. That's the best thing to do.
Test it.
Is that working better? Just a quick summary for those of you that couldn't hear. So I grew up in a farming family. My grandfather used to keep weather records from the field at the top of his garden, and I saw that sense that his approach to farming was having to shift and respond to that changing climate. And for me, there wasn't this single moment throughout my life. There have been several where I've spoken to fishermen abroad and they've said, the seasons are never normally like this, that we all begin to see that something is happening, something is different, and that we need to do something about it. But I think in recent years, particularly since 2018-19, there has been this sense of awakening, and I think we're all part of that, and the number of people in the room this evening speak to that.
Thank you. Adrian.
It's 1996 and I'm sitting at school in Norfolk in a GCSE geography lesson, and Mr. Maddox is teaching us about climate change, about deforestation, about acid rain, about major global environmental issues and the impact that they will have within our lifetimes, both on the planet and in particular on poorer countries around the world, and then in, well within our lifetimes on the UK as well, in terms of our ability to feed ourselves, our ability to live without strange weather conditions and increased flooding. And I think to myself, these are not just issues to learn about, to pass a set of tests. These are things that are major existential threats to us and that are going to affect us in our lifetimes. And so as we head into break time and tempted by the usual distractions of the school playground and so on, I'm thinking to myself, how can I make a real difference on these issues? And from those days as a teenager onwards, that moment and moments like it that formed these ideas have influenced what I've spent my time on as a campaigner, as a university lecturer, as a charity leader, and now as a politician, to seek to make a difference in whatever way I can, both at community level and at national level, to create a healthier environment in ways that can create a better future for us all here in the UK and around the world as we seek to address the climate challenges that we face.
Shall I try with this? It was in the late 80s. British scientists had discovered a hole in the ozone layer. That led to the Montreal Protocol. It led to Margaret Thatcher's speech at the UN, one of the biggest speeches she ever gave, and really shifted the dial on recognising that climate change was here. Climate change needed to be tackled, and it was going to need a global effort. And the last person to act, we would run at their pace. It's led to, as a consequence, the banning then, in 1989, of CFCs from aerosols. They were replaced by something called HFCs. I did a PhD in chemistry. Somebody in my university was particularly doing a research group on this. And overall, it's led to that element of actually seeing how the power of the sun, something we rely on every day, something that is brilliant. Of course it is. God-given, Bishop Martin. But brilliant in that its UV radiation will destroy pretty much anything. If you put your washing out, it will destroy the bacteria that's on there as well if it's a sunny day. It will destroy the bacteria in our water, given some time. Sometimes all sun, you can get a bottle of water that's got E. coli on, it'll be gone in 6 hours. A bit more cloudy, it will take a bit longer. But that's how nature-based solution and the power of the sun. But the power of the sun with that ozone layer was actually going to harm people, it was going to harm the planet, and that's why global action leading to the Montreal Protocol was the most successful environmental treaty ever, was born. And indeed 7 years ago I was the minister and managed to get ratified, the first country in the European Union as we were then, to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol as well. So for me it was about that link of science. Obviously somebody, I appreciate not everybody here will be a Conservative, but Margaret Thatcher certainly grabbed the imagination and grabbed Ronald Reagan, and by getting the US on board we made those changes. And even now today, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol will be responsible for delivering 0.4 or 0.5 of that 1.5 that we need to keep alive. And that's when I was gripped by that. And of course other things have happened since, in a slightly different way, different changes of weather, as people already said. But that's when I first knew Bishop Martin. There we go.
Therese, thank you.
Thank you, Is it on? Yes, it is on. Yes. So I think I beat Margaret Thatcher by a little bit, well, by at least 10 years probably. So when I was at school, I was already alarmed by the prospect of the effects of fossil fuels, and I campaigned in my sixth form years when we were having a general election. I was too young to vote, but we had a school mock election, and the best party available at the time who had any environmental policies were the Liberals, and it was in the good old days before the Ecology Party had even managed to get going, and or possibly it existed in one or two places. And I campaigned entirely on an environmental ticket in the school election and won the mock election outright by a long way, because actually all of us teenagers at the time, had we been able to vote, we would have changed the outcome of that election, I'm sure. For that reason, I think that it's clear from what everybody has said so far that actually asking the 16 and 17-year-olds is probably the right thing to do, because they're actually the ones who see what's happening and what the prospects for the future are. So I've spent my life going against the flow, trying to combat the direction of travel. I am distressed to see that things have got worse, not better, since I started this. So I've tried to live my own life somewhat green, but in the end, the only real action seems to be if you can change the world. And so I began to see that it was a global issue, a national issue, and that we needed political action. And that's how I got involved in politics.
Thank you, Catherine.
Firstly, can you hear me? Yes. Brilliant. Not a particularly political answer coming, really. Strangely enough, for the weather person on the panel, it's not weather related. We've always had these extremes of weather. We can count them off if we think since the war. 1947 and the big snow and the flood that followed. 1953 and the great tide and 307 people dead in East Anglia. 1962 and the great freeze. And I that's a personal interest to me because I turned up in that one. So you could date me a bit from that. 1976 and the summer of 76 and the ladybirds and the burnt things. So 87, the Great Storm, 93 and the flood in Halesworth, October 1993, 125 millimetres of rain in 48 hours. Made a mess, 46 properties flooded, something like that. So all that going through, but no one of those did I say, is this climate change? What stopped me was a simple photograph. And it compared two halves to the photograph, and on one side it showed a satellite picture of the Arctic ice on January the 1st in 1990, and on the other in 2005. And there wasn't anywhere near so much. And at that point I think, this isn't weather. This isn't about Halesworth or Suffolk or even Great Britain. This is about the world. This is a global thing. And in the early 80s, I was privileged to work on an irrigation project in the Sahel, on the fringes of the Sahara Desert. And you look at it now, and the Sahara Desert is 50 miles further on. That's what brings it home to me.
Thank you.
So, I was born in 1974, so I'm quite young. And I think, like anyone that was born then or after, I grew up with climate change. It was there. It was a constant. I didn't discover it or learn about it as some sort of revelation. It was just with us. I think the question, though, asked something different. When did I realise it was an emergency? And that is the key thing. I realised it was an emergency when it dawned on me in the late 90s that no one was acting in a way that was going to affect the change that we needed to see happening globally. And that
unless we all got together and worked out how we were going to affect that change in our individual lives, through our work, through our communities, nothing was going to happen. And I suppose that was the point when I realised that this was something urgent rather than something that I could leave to other people to deal with and address through a usual political process. And that's the point where I became an ecologist, and then I did international development, and I learned about how these global impacts, not just of climate, but we've also talked about ecosystems and biodiversity, were going to affect everyone. And that's why I began working with farmers to try and address the impacts that they were having on their farms, because, as Richard has said, farmers are completely well aware of what's happening, and they want to do what they can to affect that change. And what they need is all of us. They need routes to market. They need ways to affect that change on their farms, and we can support them in doing that. And that's what I feel my role is. That's the lever I can use to affect change in the bit of the world that I work in.
I spent my teens and 20s chaining myself to stuff, I'm afraid. And then sort of realised I should actually know something about it as well. So I went back to college in my 30s. And I guess joining the Wildlife Trust as an employee was like taking the wrong pill in the Matrix, because it suddenly opens up a whole can of worms in your head about what's going on. But I guess the thing that really drove it home, we in 2001 we started a project called the Essex and Suffolk Dormouse Project. And it was just to find out what dormice were doing in the two counties, because we knew virtually nothing about their distribution. We'd heard that they were in threat, but we didn't know anything about them. And we started surveying those two counties. We have a very good knowledge now, thankfully. But what drove it home was holding a very tiny dormouse in my hand and weighing it and finding out that it was not going to survive the winter. And that was a second litter of dormice. And really in the UK, we should only be having 1 litter of dormice. And that showed me that the patterns for these hibernating animals had changed. Their breeding patterns had changed, and they were putting themselves at risk by having these late litters. And so that little dormouse is climate change for me.
So thank you, panel. We're going to turn to our first question that's been submitted. And this one I'm going to read out. Some of them the questioner will read out. This is from Simon Clark, who says, if you travel through the lanes of Suffolk, you will have seen the signs protesting at the solar farms being built, often by developers and often on prime agricultural land. This is an example of the complexities of dealing with the climate emergency, the need to grow our own food set alongside reduction of carbon emissions, recognising at the same time the need to reduce meat consumption and minimise fertiliser use and fields of monocrops. What does the panel think is the right balance? And I'm going to turn first to Thérèse.
Well, thank you, Bishop Martin. Sorry. Thank you, Bishop Martin. And this does come up right across the country, never mind here in the area of Suffolk. And of course, people will be aware of solar farms actually on airfields. That's where there's a lot of popularity down near Woodbridge. The Army are going to put a solar farm on their airfield as well. And I think it's fair to say there tends to be a frustration from people about why is it that farmland that's used to produce food, why is it that farmers are giving that up? Well, there's a very straightforward element to that. We do need to increase the proportion of solar farm across the country. My preference tends to be that it should be on brownfield sites. We're trying to make it easier to get solar panels onto agricultural buildings. But I do understand the challenges a farmer might face. If you think that you can lease your land to somebody who will pay you a guaranteed income, anywhere between 6 and 8% return for doing not very much, at the same time, the developers will also try and say, well, of course, there is other things that could happen, some grazing, some other elements like that. So it is a fine balance. But bear in mind, across all of England, about 70% of our land is used to farm. We need about 1% of land to become solar dedicated to achieve the government's plans on how many megawatts, gigawatts of solar that we want to have there. So there will be temptation, I think, for farmers to take that, dare I say it, easier money, also bearing in mind that they are part of the market in terms of what happens in terms of pricing of food and similar. But it is the reason why this Conservative government are the people who've broken away from a funding system where the amount of subsidy you got, the EU system, that basically the 10% of the landowners get half of the money. That's how it was. And we're shifting that transition so that the public money for public good will come in. That's why we're spreading out as the amount of guaranteed income comes about how farmers and landowners can be paid to do ecosystem services, integrated pest management to use fewer pesticides, about hedgerow management, all these other factors. But I do understand at this particular time of inflation, the illegal war by Putin absolutely rammed up the cost of energy and of fertilizer and all those other aspects. So I do understand why farmers are considering it, and I do understand why communities are concerned about it. The number one priority for me for farmers is to grow food, but that doesn't have to be at the expense of the environment, far from it. It's symbiotic, and that's what the financial systems, the financial subsidies in the future will be paying them for ecosystems, rather than just, as I say, how much field is there available to grow food.
Thank you, Thérèse. Adrian, what would you like to say about that?
First of all, please say if you can't hear me clearly. I'm hoping this mic is working all right. So really important question about this balance in terms of competing uses for our land. First of all, clearly, solar and other renewables are absolutely key to both tackling the climate emergency and ensuring that we have affordable energy bills, given that renewable energy is by far the cheapest form of electricity, about 9 times cheaper than gas, and that trend will only continue. But there's a variety of ways that we can benefit from renewables, and they all need more support. If we look at solar, for example, the amount of potential for solar on our roofs is way in excess of where it is at the moment, and the government has taken a very start-stop approach to incentive schemes to help more people benefit from solar PV on their roofs. And one particular point I'd raise on that is that the future home standard is currently being considered by government, going out to consultation soon. That will dictate the planning requirements for new build from 2025 onwards. And what I would say is, why on earth would the government not require that all new homes and buildings have to have solar PV? I'm sure that's something we would all welcome, and any government representative here tonight that wanted to comment on plans on that, I'm sure we'd be pleased to hear that as an exclusive. So that's really important. Having said that, I do think solar farms need to be part of the mix, and certainly any number crunching I've seen about the range of renewables we need suggests that it's part of the picture that's needed. But it does need to be done in the right way, and I'd make a few points on that. First of all, that we could see far more solar farms developed in a way where the communities are able to benefit financially from them. Greater promotion of community-owned renewables. And there's legislation before Parliament at the moment, the local electricity bill, which would reduce the costs that the middleman takes in that transaction to ensure that communities can benefit more directly from those. And then when particular solar farm proposals are put forward, at the moment, the government has an encouragement for councils to consider them favourably. Of course, councils can, around the edges, negotiate with developers. And so, for example, Green councillors in mid-Suffolk are negotiating with developers around a proposal in Palgrave, where residents are saying this proposal goes too close to the surrounding properties, or are asking questions around, is it being done in a way that is good for biodiversity? Actually, there's examples of solar farms in North America where biodiversity has improved and food growing has happened around the solar farms, but they have to be planned in the right way to ensure that, and I think it's perfectly right for councils and communities to ask those questions when proposals are brought forward. So to broaden it out slightly though, because the question is about land use and the range of different ways in which we need to use our land. And this is very timely because just this week we've seen the latest State of Nature report from 60 different nature organisations in the UK, one of the most comprehensive nature studies in the world. And it's shown yet again a very stark message that Britain is one of the most nature-deprived countries on Earth. Around 40% of our bird species are under threat, around 10% of insects, which are absolutely fundamental to our ecosystems. And of course, thriving nature is about good mental health and well-being and enjoyment of the countryside. But as essential as those things are, it's even more existential than that. Nature is about us having access to clean air, clean water, clean food. And we ignore it at our peril, and it's really unbelievable. The stark nature of this is not headline news in the media. I challenged one media outlet last night over their approach to it. So I think we need to heed the warnings of the 60 nature organisations that are behind the State of Nature report, who've made it very clear that human activity in terms of intensive forms of land management, in terms of climate change, is driving this degradation of nature. And as Josiah rightly said, farmers in particular, also gardeners, are at the forefront of knowing and seeing the decline in nature and the impact that that's having. And I know farmers who I speak to all the time who want to be able to manage their land in ways that really benefit wildlife. And Thérèse rightly talked about the ELM payment system that's come in to help more farmers benefit from funding for wildlife-friendly forms of farming. But only 20% of farmland in the UK is on the higher level agri-environmental schemes. That's nowhere near far enough. And the State of Nature report made clear that the entry level to those schemes is failing. So I think we need to listen to the calls from this Nature 2030 coalition of charities, who are, amongst other things, are asking for a doubling of financial support for farmers to manage land in ways that are good for wildlife, for not just protecting nature, but restoring land, both on land and seas, restoring those habitats so that 30% of our land and seas is managed for the benefit of wildlife by 2030, and establishing human right to be at clean air, water and access to nature. And again, as we happen to have the Environment Secretary here, if she wants to comment on government plans, I'm sure we'd all be interested to hear that. But this Nature 2030 set of organisations are asking for political parties to sign up to these commitments in their manifestos, and I think we should all monitor closely what parties do commit to, because these issues are fundamental and central to the future of farming, to our well-being, to our health of our environment, and to tackling both the climate and nature crises.
Josiah, just a few words, perhaps.
Yeah, just briefly. Just to pick up, perhaps, on some of what you were saying, Adrian and Thérèse, as well, is that we need to look at land use as a whole. And I think solar parks are a very visible land use change. We can really see them. They're a temporary structure in the countryside, and it's very obvious, and they have an impact. But the way that land is used currently is also deeply problematic. I'm sure most people are aware that huge areas of rye are grown every year to supply bioenergy in Beccles. And, the wrongs and rights of that energy production we could discuss, but that land is already heavily industrialised, and it's used to produce a monoculture which is quite depleted of diversity. And, 50% of the wheat and barley that we drive past as we travel around in rural Suffolk, that's all fed to intensively raised livestock in sheds, largely. And that's deeply problematic as well. And the consequences of those animal raising kind of exercises are having a huge impact, which is largely invisible because they still look like fields and they still look like sheds in the countryside. And I think we really need to think about the fact that, in the UK we kill 1 billion chickens a year for human consumption, and we import 3 million tonnes of soya, mostly from South America, to feed those chickens and also pigs. And that kind of invisible, embedded impact of an industrial food system is as significant as industrial energy production on that same land. And I think we just need to keep all of that in mind when we're looking at the whole picture about land use.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next question, which Ginny Williams is going to ask herself. Where is Ginny?
Hello, thank you for taking my question. It's kind of relevant to this discussion, actually, because seeing as we have a church in every parish in the country with a south-facing roof, I'm wondering what's causing the delay in what's causing the delay in the solar panels on church roofs, and what kind of combination of effort we need, both from the church and from planners and other community and traditional church organisations.
Thank you, Ginny. I'm going to turn to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Bishop. So Ginny has expressed this question as about obstacles to solar on churches. And I'm thinking that maybe we could try to turn it round more positively and think about what would enable schemes to come into place that would actually benefit from putting solar on churches and how we would do that. It is possible. For example, King's College Chapel is currently having solar panels installed. So the objection that a listed building can't have solar panels on it is just not the case, right? So we then need to think, well, why would we want to do that? So one of the things that perhaps we need to think about is the possibility that it isn't happening very much because we're not seeing the potential for using that resource for community energy schemes. Because the church itself has a very small carbon footprint on the whole. Usually the buildings don't use a lot of energy. And so it might seem otiose to generate so much energy from a huge roof, which is available when the church itself doesn't have much of a carbon footprint. And so one of the obstacles, I am going to talk about obstacles, one of the obstacles is the mentality that says, oh, we're going to count up our carbon footprint and we're going to get us to net zero. And that is a widespread practice, which I think actually we need to question. Because if you think only about the institution that you're in and say, how can I get to net zero? Oh, I only need to do this little thing and tick this little box, then I've done it. You don't see the possibility of saying, I could contribute to a much wider solution, something that goes beyond this building and this community. So rethinking the possibility that actually there could be community energy schemes. Now, why do we not have community energy schemes? Well, because we need leadership and government initiatives to promote community energy schemes. Is there a particular problem for churches? Yes, there is. There are small, aging population, aging congregations, overstretched, lacking the resources, without enough expertise. So I think that how would we actually bring it about? Again, I think that it would be really helpful if some wonderful imaginative enterprise were to come along and say, we're going to do a pilot scheme, we will do all the applications for grants, we will do all the organisation, and you will get a feed-in tariff. Why do we not have a feed-in tariff that is adequate to make this worthwhile? Because the government is not keeping up the feed-in tariffs. So there are lots of things we could do. We could provide charging points, we could charge electric scooters, we could do all sorts of wonderful community things, and we could have a warm building that could be used during the week and all sorts of other benefits. But we can't do it because the initiative requires that there be adequate input from somewhere to make this possible for small congregations to do. Oh, by the way, I brought copies of a report that was done for me while I was a member of the European Parliament, which is it's called Energising the East. There are lots of free copies at the back. Do help yourself. They were paid for by the European Union, and it's quickly going out of date because it was supposed to get the East of England carbon neutral by 2030, and it won't happen.
Richard.
Thank you, and I have the handheld mic, so hopefully you can hear me, and it saves me from sitting on Adrian's knee, so that you can. I suppose I can speak to this a little from a county council point of view. We're not a planning authority, so we don't determine which buildings can and can't have solar on their roofs. But every year for the last 5 or 6 years, we've run a scheme called Solar Together. And the letter may have landed on many of your doorsteps recently, suggesting that you enter into a group buying initiative through the county council to get panels with a guarantee or a level of confidence in the supplier of choice. Now, whenever we send out this letter, I get countless emails back saying, I live in a listed building, it's incredibly difficult. Or I live in a conservation area, and it's incredibly difficult. So there is an element, I think, Catherine, despite what you say, there is an element here of planning legislation that makes it more challenging for listed buildings and those in conservation areas to have solar on their rooftops. Now, what can the church do about that? They can certainly lobby. What can we all do about that? We can lobby. But there will need to be a change in planning guidance for that to be made easier.
Planning authorities operate on the government's instructions.
But what I would add, and I think it's a key point on so many of the issues that we'll discuss tonight, is that we need to speak to the people who aren't in the room this evening. I think everybody who is in the room this evening absolutely buys into the challenges we face and some of the steps that may need to be taken to address that. But to give you a little bit of insight, after I sent out that email, sent out the letter, the mail shot to the whole of Suffolk, I had an email deeply criticising me for suggesting I would scar the beautiful Suffolk street scene with solar panels. So there is another viewpoint out there. There are those that value beautiful historic high streets like we have here in Halesworth that don't want to see solar on those rooftops. So a balance does need to be struck, and we do need to protect the appearance of our key buildings as well.
Thank you. I wonder if I dare speak from the chair about this, since I know a little bit about it. It is possible to put solar panels, as we've heard, King's Chapel, York Minster now as well. It is possible to put solar panels on church roofs. What English Heritage are saying is you can put them on if you've got a parapet that obscures view of the panels from the ground. And some churches have parapets. Now, the thing that English Heritage don't seem to have caught up with, and maybe this is also planning regulations haven't caught up with, is that, as far as I can tell, we've moved on from the shiny tin foil solar panels to rather quite subtle dark panels that would blend in quite nicely with a slate roof. So I think, I'm hoping that we'll see a movement, a shift on some of those regulations. In terms of the point, Catherine, you were making, this diocese, along with the neighbouring 4 dioceses, so 5 of us in this region, the eastern region, have received funding from the national church to employ 5 people who will help us do this. So 1 for each diocese, but each with a different specialty so that they can work together as a team. So I'm hoping that we'll move in the direction you're talking about. And there's a lot of impetus to do so. And I think the whole point about, you know, as you say, churches can generate more electricity than they're going to use. So let that be for community benefit in one way or another. Catherine, one more.
I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that you can indeed get solar panels that look exactly like slates. They are slates, effectively. I see no reason why somebody shouldn't develop solar panels that look exactly like LED. This is only a matter of the scale and the convenience of. They're not going to do it as a one-off, but if there were lots wanting it, why not have lots? Also, solar panels make the lead harder to steal, and they're also temporary, so it's not like you're ruining your listed building forever, because they can be taken down.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to our next question, which Kim Hoare is going to ask. Kim.
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Given that everyone on the panel recognises the significance of climate change, I'd like to hear panelists' views on the elephant in the room, the announcement of the exploitation of the Rosebank oil field.
Quick one.
I have to decide whether to allow that because we were prepared on the basis of the questions that were submitted. I'm going to. I'd be interested because the other one's about empty shops, and I will go back to that one. Let's have a brief word from whoever would like to say something on that question. Catherine.
I would like to say that it's a climate crime. I think that it's absolutely appalling to be opening an oil field. It won't help with energy security because it will be sold on the open market. It will just enable more oil to be consumed, which is the opposite direction from what we should be going in.
You will hear that exact same message from the wildlife trusts nationally and locally. We don't believe that this is the time to be opening up new reserves. We have to keep everything that is in the ground, and that is the only way we are going to get out of this climate emergency. And so I won't say any more than that.
One more? Richard?
You go first. I'll go last.
Adrian.
I think you could probably...
I'll go last.
I will speak briefly, but I think you can guess my position, and it would be interesting to hear the Secretary of State's comment. Just to add briefly to what the previous two speakers have said, the most startling statistic I've seen on this is that the amount of emissions that the Rosebank oil field will create is equivalent to the 28 most deprived countries in the world. You know, this is serious stuff, and as we've heard, it's just not compatible with any sort of climate science. And it just, I mean, any illusion that the Prime Minister thought he was trying to pull with the dreadful speech 10 days ago that the net zero targets were still there, this just blew that out of the water. And frankly, it's just deeply irresponsible for the government to be pulling the rug from targets, yes, targets that I would have said were not quick or adequate enough, but targets it had put in place for decarbonisation of things like the car sector and the home heating sector, when those sectors, those industries were gearing up for that transition and have said themselves, this is undermining our business models. So, you know, it's a very odd approach for a Conservative government from an economic point of view, and, as Catherine says, a climate crime.
I'm happy to speak, but I wanted to go last.
Absolutely. All I would say, obviously, is that the oil field is in Scotland and is therefore a matter for the Scottish Environment Agency and not for us.
Therèse.
So the Rosebank development has been authorised by an independent regulator. If I think about what the Climate Change Committee has said, they perfectly accept that still using oil and gas is part of that transition. Now, we are on track. I think back to Glasgow, I've been to 4 climate COPs. Glasgow galvanised the world again. No doubt about that. And that's when we made our commitment. The UK, the Conservative government, made the commitment about 68% emissions reduction by 2030. We're actually still on track to achieve 67% of that, and we need to go a little bit further to try and get the 1% too. So I am not going to take any lectures, frankly, when it is the Conservative government that has driven the reduction in emissions. And if I think back to our change from the 90s, our footprint on the world has gone down. We're now using about a third of what we were. At the same time, we've exceeded our carbon budgets, and I thought the Green Party might actually believe in a just transition. There are rural communities here who are struggling to make that transition away from being off the gas grid, from their oil boilers. That's why we're putting up the subsidy to help people with heat pumps. But even then, some of it is really difficult for our housing. At the same time, as I say, we've already hit our carbon budgets and we're making that transition. It's got to be a just transition. So coming back to oil production, yes, it's a global market, but at the moment, we do recall, by the way, that a lot of our diesel, a significant 20% of our diesel, was based on Russian oil. Now we have OPEC reducing production, so that's increasing the prices for people. That has a direct impact on inflation, a direct impact on the cost of living, a direct impact on people living in and around Halesworth in terms of the costs of living. And the Prime Minister made a decision, recognising the great achievements we'd already made, to support the decision of that independent authority to allow the licence. And of course, I'm very conscious that many of you would wish we would go faster and further. But I put it to you that even with this, we will still be seeing a much quicker reduction in use of fossil fuel in this country than in the rest of the world, and that we no longer are powered by coal, unlike Germany. So those are the sorts of things where we continue to have global leadership, and of course it was uncomfortable, I'm sure, for many people last week. But that is why I believe it was a pragmatic, proportionate response, and it's absolutely critical that we have to take people with us on this just transition.
I'm going to move, thank you, I'm going to move to the question that Kim was going to ask, because I think it's local. To achieve net zero, she was going to ask, we need to be able to access local shops and services. For the first time in years, I'm seeing empty shops in Halesworth. What can we, the people of Halesworth, do? And what can we, this panel, do in response to that so that we can access local shops and services? And I was going to ask Josiah.
Yeah, thanks. I think to be honest, given what we've just been discussing, shopping locally seems a drop in the ocean, to be honest, literally and metaphorically. And unless we're prepared to address some of these big structural challenges we face, shopping locally is just not going to cut it. I could answer a lot more about what we could do to support local businesses and how shopping locally reinvest money in the local economy, that there's a multiplier effect that has a knock-on effect and a benefit for a whole community, from the food producers all the way through to those that are buying and eating food, and that more broadly locally we could do a lot through public procurement. So there are things that both government and the local authority could do to increase the amount of locally sourced food that we're seeing in schools and in hospitals and in care homes and in those public spaces. And that where that's happened in other cities, I did a fantastic visit to Copenhagen in Denmark last year, where I was shown around by 3 city councillors who showed me how, having identified that they had a nitrate pollution problem around Copenhagen, which was a water quality issue, they realised that by encouraging farmers to change their practice, and back in the mid-2000s the route that they chose was organic conversion, they could reduce the pressure of that pollution issue but that in order to make that work for the farmers, they had to offer them a market for the crops that they were growing. So they changed their procurement policies in order to buy from those farms, and that had a knock-on effect of changing how people ate at home. So it affected what people were doing at their homes because they were eating differently when they were away from home. So I think there's a really fantastic example there of how local government and local farming and a local food system can emerge to support local communities, and that's had a knock-on effect onto local purchasing. So people are now looking for those foods in shops in and around Copenhagen. And I think what was really fascinating about that visit was that talking to the councillors as they were showing all of this, it became clear that they were from three very different parties with opposing views and opinions on how some of these things should be delivered. And I asked them the question, how is it that you're able to work together? And they explained that there are a lot of parties in the city council and that they all agree when something is a good idea and they implement it. And I thought, well, that's a really refreshing breath of fresh air, isn't it? And I think it would be great if we saw more of that. And I think maybe that's a bigger systemic change around how our politics works. But I think it would be brilliant if having identified a good idea, we could all just agree to get on with it and make it happen.
Richard.
Thank you. I think I'd start by disagreeing with Josiah that this is actually, although it doesn't sound perhaps as glamorous or as heavy-hitting, it is a really, really important issue. I think both during the pandemic and now the illegal war in Ukraine, we see the value in short supply chains, in supporting rural businesses and supporting those businesses that are on our doorstep. So I think it is actually an incredibly important issue. I think Kim's question was in two parts. It was first, what can you, the people of Halesworth, do? And I think the first thing is when you have those fantastic small independent businesses, is use them. I think we've all been guilty in the past of lamenting the loss of a shop on our high street and then realising we haven't been in for 4 or 5 months. So support them. I think in this era of Amazon Prime and next day delivery, support your local high street. It's so important.
Sorry, Richard, I'm just going to cut in briefly because this is a question about net zero specifically.
Yeah, absolutely, Josiah. And I think Kim's question puts it quite acutely, that to achieve net zero, we do need to support the local high street and access local shops. And I'm agreeing with Kim, it's absolutely important. And I'd be quite shocked to hear you sit here and say, don't support the local high street.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying in the context.
Well, yeah, but it's important. It's really important.
It's important, Richard, but in the context of what's been announced, the exploration of a whole new oil field, it seems like we're being asked, through personal choice and through our wallets, to effect a change locally that government is not committed to through policy around energy.
I think just for Halesworth, but if everybody nationally focused on shopping locally and shopping on their local high street, it becomes a national decision. No, I will come to that. But I think the second part of the question is what can we do to support the local high street? What can we on this panel do? And I think the first thing we need to do is recognise the rurality of areas like Suffolk, to accept that people need to use their cars to access towns like Halesworth. To support, of course, as well, public transport, cycling, walking, but in a rural community like this, people do use their cars. So one of the things we've been doing to support the transition to electric vehicles through Plug-in Suffolk, we've received £7.2 million of government funding. We've installed 100 new rural charging points across Suffolk, another 200 are coming, and we're supporting the rollout of rapid EV charging hubs as well. So I think that's something we as local authorities can absolutely do to support rural communities, whilst accepting that people in rural areas do need to use their cars. I think the other thing we can do is when we develop policies either around housing, highways, any other infrastructure, is that those respect the unique characteristics of towns like Halesworth and making sure that developments are properly integrated with them. so that people who live there can easily shop locally. I think we can all look at examples across Suffolk where we have got the planning wrong and new communities haven't been properly integrated, they haven't had those sustainable links, and people haven't been able to support their local high street. And absolutely, to your question in the front row about the cost of shopping locally, it is more expensive, absolutely, it can be. But I think the only way we can drive down those prices is by supporting those retailers, to give them those economies of scale. That they won't get any cheaper if we don't use them.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question, which Fiona Gilmore is going to ask.
I thought somebody was going to ask it on Fiona's behalf.
Oh, wait. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You're
Perhaps
right.
you,
You're
Richard
right.
Martin.
I'll read it out. While it is clear that offshore wind farms need an infrastructure to deliver to the grid, Lion Link landfall has caused a great deal of local upset as once again valuable SSI areas seem to be losing out to economic considerations. Do you think that we have struck the right balance between protecting our natural environments and the economic considerations, and to what degree is the decision made by big business, in this case the National Grid and Scottish Power? And I'm going to ask Thérèse to speak first.
So I've been trying to work on this for several years now as the Member of Parliament for Suffolk Coastal, and SPR were the people who started this off. Good planning permission was given to them to bring their cables onshore. They were going to do direct current, DC, and it was designed initially to come on, and the wires are still there, so to speak, or the tubes, at Martlesham, down further south of Woodbridge, coming in via Boardsea similar. Because of an economic decision made by SPR, they changed their mind. They weren't going to get as much money from the taxpayer in order to make this happen. And that's where we've led to this almost domino effect, potentially, of offshore infrastructure coming on to other parts of the Suffolk coast in terms of providing no jobs, lots of disruption through cabling and similar, and indeed elsewhere the aspects of the potential for pylons stretching from Norwich to Tilbury, which doesn't particularly affect this constituency, but the wider point is there to be made. So I've long believed and tried to push for having offshore grids, having that cabling, having it connect lower down at Bradwell in Essex, where there is a disused nuclear power station, which would need to have upgrading of cabling to take it into the main grid. But I am very frustrated about where we are on this. This is all about an acceleration of what has been happening in terms of trying to get more offshore wind. You know, we have the largest offshore wind farms in the world, and we continue to need to have them. Our East Coast wind is brilliant. The Irish Sea is pretty good as well. So we have to try and make that work. But the line link is an interconnection with the continent. And this is part of an important part of energy security. But as I will continue to campaign as the Member for Parliament Suffolk Coastal, it's the wrong location, it's the wrong choice, and I will keep asking my government colleagues to change their minds, to make sure National Grid does the right thing, to ask the Environment Agency to continue to press on these matters. But I am conscious our regulators who did approve the mitigations for the Sizewell Sea, that we just continue to try and work at this together, because of course we want offshore wind. We're relaxing the rules on onshore wind again. We need a variety of sources of energy to be renewable and zero carbon, but I think this is the wrong approach, and that's why I'll continue to campaign against it.
David.
The question asked about balance, and those balance of the offshore wind coming ashore that we need, and the protection of the triple SIs and things that are on the coast where it comes ashore. the Environment Agency has a stake in that protection and also in doing things on the coast, of course. When I look at that the balance, I'm reminded that part of my team produce a very specialised permit called a flood risk activity permit to make sure that anything coming onto the coast does not cause increase in flood risk to those people living alongside. And they operate the rules and the permits which were within the specified legislation. And I feel their frustration at the things they feel they could do, but they have to follow the rules. So that's on one side. The other part of my team are engineers looking to build defences and protect people from flooding along the coast as well. And I feel their frustration when they see how much protection there is on the coast. We have a huge amount of the whole of the coast of East Anglia has a load of protection zones on it, from special protection areas to special areas of conservation to Ramsar sites to the SSSIs itself, and they all come with those with special rules which we have to follow. When we work on the coast, there are very small time frames in which we can work. You know, we want to avoid all those wonderful overwintering birds which come down the East Coast Flyway. So that takes us out from mid-November through to March. And then we want to avoid the nesting birds, which are there in the summer. So we have to work through, and we can't do much from really end of March onwards, through to September. So you'll see us gearing up to get ready to do the work in those few short months that we have each year. And in that, we also try and protect what we're doing. We go to an awful lot of effort and expense to protect and move animals and allow them to move back. You'll see us how we move the water vole. And we all love the water vole because we remember him hanging around with toad and with mole in our childhood. But we also look after the rather less heralded species. We have on the coast of Suffolk in our flood walls, the clay flood walls with the grass bank on, we have this tiny sail called Des Moulins world snail, and that's protected. And to look after where we enhance, make a bank a bit bigger or a bit stronger or a bit wider, we're going to strip that grass off and put it carefully on one side. Because if you have a big Des Moulins snail, he's going to be 2.6 millimetres high. So we're looking after him, we're looking after those because they all form part of the ecology and things that goes forward. So we're working hard on that. But the big threat in a climate change conference to those beautiful sites on the coast is the sea coming in. And we've been working at that a long time, and through our shoreline management plans, we identify the sites which are most likely to go under, and we compensate through them, through the Regional Habitat Compensation Scheme. So over the last 10 years, we've created over 400 hectares of new habitat, taken farmland again from the farmers and creating this stuff at Wallasey Island down in Essex, Fingering Hoe also in Essex, down the road here at Snape, and that helps to mitigate that. We haven't lost it yet, but that mitigation is in there to try and keep that balance. So we put an awful lot of effort into both sides of the equation, and I appreciate the balance of the frustrations on both sides.
I'm going to just ask Adrian for a few words on this question, and then I'm going to move on to the next question.
Thank you. So several of us have spoken tonight about how crucial it is to increase renewables, and offshore wind is a crucial part of that. At the same time, there are understandable major concerns from local communities, both about the proposed route of the big pylons that do go through the heart of the Waveney Valley constituency, and for the substations and routes proposed to come onshore, both near here for the Lion Link and at various other parts of the East Suffolk coast. And this is often presented as if we have somehow a choice between those two things. Do you want the renewables or do you want to stop the infrastructure? Well, that's not the case. If we look at other countries, such as the Netherlands, for example, they take an integrated approach to their infrastructure, which includes having offshore grids and cables and interconnectors, which can minimise the number of places where it needs to be brought onshore and enable the sort of things that Thérèse was talking about, of having those onshore connectivity points being on brownfield sites that are closer to areas of bigger population where the energy is most needed. So we need a more integrated approach to our infrastructure. And when I was debating with another Conservative MP for this region, Jerome Mayhew, on the BBC a couple of months ago, his view was that East Anglia has been left behind in terms of regional infrastructure planning. And I think that's probably something here that we can all agree on, that we have been left behind. Green councillors proposed around 15 years ago that we can properly consider an offshore grid. Many others in the room and on the panel clearly support that. What I was slightly bemused about by Thérèse's answer is I understand her position as a local representative, but Thérèse, you're also part of the government. And National Grid have said themselves that an integrated approach could be cheaper if it was done looking at all projects in the round rather than one at a time. And we moved away from this.
Well, that is the change in policy, Adrian. And you've mentioned the interconnector to the Netherlands. The line link is between the Netherlands and the UK. So,
yeah, but there was
on one hand, you praise the Netherlands for having an interconnector. It's coming here.
Yeah, but the point is...
The challenge is, where does it come on board?
Absolutely.
And that's the main difficulty. And we're changing from a radial approach, where it used to be gas-fired and coal in the centre of the country with a radial out to the different parts of the network. We are shifting, we're moving at a quicker pace, but I agree. I wish this had been done earlier.
Yeah. But
I really do.
So we can agree on that. The question is, given your view and that you're in the cabinet, is the government going to come behind the view you're expressing?
Well, the thing about being a cabinet minister, you have collective responsibility, but I am and do campaign about the issue affecting my constituency. Ultimately, the decision is made by other people on where the connections happen, but that's overall. We have a much more offshore wind in the Netherlands, much more than the other countries you've mentioned. And that is why, dare I say it, Claire Coutinho now is between a rock and a hard place on how we get all this renewable energy into this. But I'm determined, as the local MP, to continue to say there is a better place for this to be connected, and I will keep fighting for it as long as I can.
Thank you. In an attempt to get us to finish by 8 o'clock, which I suspect we may run over a little bit, I'm going to ask us that we go down to 2 people per question, and I'll try and distribute that fairly. So the next question is, according to the government's official statistics, this is from Simon Frampton, we import 46% of our food. If you count the carbon cost of production in the country of origin, especially fertiliser, as well as transport, these imports carry a large carbon footprint. What are the government's specific plans to reduce these imports to align with their net zero carbon target of 2030 and also bolster the food security of the country? I may actually have to go to 3 of this. So, Josiah first.
Well, I can't comment on government policy, but I can sort of give a sort of an overview from our perspective, and the Hodmedod as a business grew out of a project that occurred in Norwich in the mid-2000s, where we asked a very simple question: could Norwich feed itself? And if it did do that, how would land use and diets need to change? And obviously Norwich has a responsibility to feeding a wider hinterland, not just in Norfolk, but the metropolitan areas and also places abroad, because Norfolk's a big food producer. And I think what was really interesting in that work that we did was that Norwich could feed itself, actually, from quite a small radius, and it wouldn't necessarily compromise Norfolk's ability to feed other areas. But the challenge with that model was that diets would have to change fairly significantly and land use would have to change fairly significantly. So that means a lot less meat, not no meat, but a lot less meat, a lot more beans, and we sell beans now as a lever for sort of systems change in this process, but also a consideration about how we're using land and what we're doing with that land. And in the question is the mention of nitrogen fertilisers, synthetic fertilisers, and globally, nitrogen fertiliser synthetically produced through the Haber-Bosch process is a significant contributor to global climate change. That's both through its manufacture, which is very high energy, it uses gas, but also its application and nitrification of those fertilizers. And we really need to move away from systems that are dependent on those synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And that, again, is a place where leguminous crops, beans and peas, incorporated into rotation can make a significant difference to our requirement for those energy-intensive and carbon-intensive inputs. And I think what's really interesting about the UK is that, in principle, about 20% of the land area in the UK could be dedicated to the production of pulse crops, which are having this beneficial effect on the soil, but also a beneficial effect on our health and making a contribution to our agricultural economy. But at the moment, it's significantly less than 5% of the area. And I think in thinking about import substitution and how we move away from those imported crops, we need to think about how we change land use in our own country and also what we're eating. And I don't think anyone's going to stop wanting to eat coffee or chocolate or avocados. I don't think there's any reason why we should. And global trade has a really positive force for good if it's done properly. It can be very exploitative and destructive, but I don't think it needs to be. We just need to bring the same consideration to imports as we do to our own production. I think one of the challenges at the moment is there's a lack of transparency within the food system. When you buy products in the shop, it's often very difficult to know exactly where they've come from. Not perhaps the thing that you're actually buying, but the ingredients that have gone into it. And in terms of those ingredients, I would include animal feeds that have gone into the production of chickens and pigs and beef to a lesser extent. So we need to consider all of that. And I think one of the things that the government could do is insist on greater supply chain transparency, so it's much easier for consumers to know exactly where everything has come from. And the government is in the midst, DEFRA is in the midst of implementing an agricultural transition plan that actually has some really positive aspects. One of them, which Adrian mentioned earlier, which is the ELM scheme, which allows farmers to access money in order to do very progressive things. There's a new sustainable farming incentive at the SFI, which again is allowing farmers to diversify what they're doing and looking at new production methods that might be quite high risk without those payments, and that's really positive. On the other hand, the government is also signing trade agreements with countries in other parts of the world which will undercut our UK agriculture sector. And that's massively problematic, particularly when those foods are anonymised in the shops and we don't really have a choice about where they've come from. So it'll be interesting to hear how the government might think of adding greater transparency and allowing us to do what Richard was suggesting earlier and make an active choice about purchasing locally and supporting local farming and food systems.
I'm going to ask Catherine to say a few words, and then I'm going to ask Thérèse to say a few words about this.
So government net zero targets and calculations haven't covered shipping or aviation emissions hitherto. It's now been added to the 6th carbon budget, which is covering the period 2033 to 2037. So the aim there is to cut emissions from shipping and aviation by 78% by 2035. Versus, this is cutting them versus 1990. So that would add a calculation that actually counted the cost of the importing these goods, which is currently not counted in our net zero calculations. Do we think that they will get anywhere near that without cooking the books in some other ways? It seems difficult to believe, right? But then, meanwhile, the emissions are currently rising, and it still doesn't include offshoring. So what we're not seeing is our government counting the emissions and damage caused by the crops grown in other countries that we then import, so the embodied emissions. So it still might look as if you'd actually get closer to net zero if you move the production of food offshore so that you don't have to count the intensive farming, especially if you've got lower welfare and emission standards in the place where it's produced. So we really need a proper calculation that includes the carbon embedded in the imports. The second thing I wanted to say is that cheap is not good. So linking to the local shops question and the question, why don't we buy things in the local shops? Our problem is not a cost of living crisis, it's a low wages crisis. We don't actually pay people enough. They cannot afford local, seasonal, organic food that has been properly produced. So we're actually causing the demand for poor quality food and imported food from low welfare and low emissions, low carbon emissions requirements, because people are paid too little and they cannot afford to go anywhere but the supermarket, where you will actually find imported apples now, and that's ridiculous.
Bishop Martin Simon is quite a regular correspondent with my office, so I'll send him a fuller answer. I'm just conscious it's coming up to his box. So, in terms of food security, it's absolutely critical. The primary role of farmers is to help get food in our plates. And that's why we have a target of about 60%, that's our rough amount that we produce, being self-sufficient. As Josiah said, we're not going to grow coffee, we're not going to grow oranges, we're not going to grow bananas. So in terms of our trade deals, of course this is a two-way street, and it's important that we also recognise that we can export a lot of our brilliant projects around the world. And frankly, it's quite a lot of the foods that we produce either from land or the fish that we catch. Other parts of the world are prepared to pay a lot more than people in this country are. So that is the important trade. Coming back to some of the, yes, we are incentivising more sustainable, generative food production, but I think there's a critical thing. It's up in Norwich, it's John Innes Centre, the research centre, and from that we actually, when we left the European Union, we legislated to allow gene editing of food. That will allow the future development of plant editing of wheat. It will allow other things that can help try and tackle some of the diseases that come. So there's a way when we use science to really help that for the future and to have less of that fertiliser, less of that pesticide in order to generate food safely and also resiliently for many generations to come.
Thank you. It's nearly 8 o'clock. I've got 3 more questions. Are you all right for a few more minutes if we ask them to be brief in their responses? So the next question I've got is Chris Hart's. If Chris would like to read this out, then I'm going to ask Richard and then Adrian to respond to this.
Yes, Alan. Current housing development in Halesworth has proven to be a topic of conversation. Housing is both carbon neutral and meets the social needs of the community. It's essential to a sustainable Halesworth. Is it time to revisit planning law to enable local councils to reach their net zero obligations and to determine local housing needs?
So Richard first and then Adrian.
Thank you, Chris, for the question. I think there's 2 elements to this. The first is, yes, I think you're right that there needs to be, as a driver, some sort of planning change to adjust or improve the carbon neutrality or the carbon output of our new housing stock. What I would say, however, is that any change needs to carry the industry with us. I think we need to be acutely aware of added costs for both those purchasing new homes, those trying to get onto the housing ladder, those who run housing associations. So there is a cost element there. There's that factor to it. I don't think it can be purely driven by planning legislation, however. And recently I visited somebody in Suffolk, a chap called Nick Woolley, who's quite an expert in carbon neutrality in buildings, and he's built a house called Pilgrim's Barn, a fascinating place, that at the cost per square metre that he's constructed this home, it's actually converted chicken sheds, would you believe? It was done at a cost lower than the average cost per square metre for the industry at large. So there's an element there of shifting building practices within the industry because they have established supply chains, they have ways of working, And this building method, I think it's called the Hockerton method, is very, very different. And it would need to be established within the industry. We need to train people up in how to do it. So I think, yes, there's a place for legislation, but there's also, it needs to be industry-led as well. The other point I would make is that we need to ensure that councils across Suffolk work together a little more. We have, as you know, several district councils, the county council, and I think I would like to see a much more unified approach to housing across the district planning authorities, so that we didn't have a piecemeal approach to environmental standards. And equally, there's a point in there perhaps around local government reform, and you have the local planning authorities of districts, then you have me on the county council, and we're in charge of highways and all of the infrastructure around that. And I think by putting the two together, you could have a much more sustainable approach to both new communities and housing going forward.
Thank you. Adrian? Fairly brief, Adrian. So my short answer to the question is yes, local councils should have more powers over setting local housing requirements in terms of meeting housing need and in terms of sustainability. The story I hear all the time across Waveney Valley and beyond is that people are seeing expensive homes being built that are out of the reach of local people being priced out of their local communities, too often built on greenfield sites, not being built to high environmental standards, which of course helps keep people's bills down, and without the investment that's needed alongside that in local infrastructure, whether that's doctors and dentist places, whether it's school places or bus services that have really been seriously eroded in rural communities. So yes, there need to be stronger planning powers that local councils can have to be tough on developers with investing in those local infrastructure improvements that need to go alongside developments, that are ensuring that those homes are being built in the right place and that they are affordable to the local communities who need them. And I mentioned, in terms of environmental standards, I mentioned the government is about to consider the future home standard. What will be the level of environmental requirement for new homes built after 2025? Well, it's taken far too long for the government to consider this, and what I would say is it absolutely must be the case that those homes are required to be built to zero carbon standards, very high levels of insulation, and with renewable electricity and heating required as standard, which will be great for those homes and the jobs that go alongside them, and it will help boost and grow that industry so that we can then all benefit from more accessible and reduced costs of solar panels and heat pumps for our homes. So I really, really hope that's something the government adopts in the coming months.
I'm going to move on fairly speedily, if I may, to the next question, and I'm going to ask Darren and Thérèse to respond to this. Central government is reversing protection such as nitrate-sensitive zones for building. Also, their plan is to reduce untreated sewage overflow into our rivers over 25 years at an unacceptably slow pace. What can we do at a local level to protect our rivers and other habitats from this destruction? What will the government do to accelerate the rebuilding of our failing sewage infrastructure? Darren.
Okay, so we've got it. So we'll be quick on this one. So if I answer the what you can do locally, for a start, there are a number of ways that you can monitor your rivers. We are always looking for citizen scientists at the wildlife trusts to contact your wildlife trust about how you would become a river champion and start to monitor your own stretch of river, and also be the eyes and ears so that we can report anything that actually happens on the ground as it happens and make sure that the Environment Agency know what is going on. There is a scheme called the Big River Watch, which is run by the Rivers Trust. So I would say look at that online, find out about that. That will take you 15 minutes on your local river. So you will actually be able to start to input into a large-scale data set which monitors what's going on at a local level. And just be aware that things will happen at a government level, like the nutrient neutrality amendment that was placed and defeated, I have to say, but requiring councils in those sensitive areas to ignore the evidence of the Environment Agency and Natural England if there was going to be harm. That cannot be allowed to pass through. We will tackle that at national level, at the Wildlife Trusts and other bodies, and we will be your eyes and ears at that level.
Well, David Kemp, being from the Environment Agency, will lead on regulation. Of course, fees that all these different people who have permits there to do inspections. So there's a variety of ways that it can happen, and there are more powers available to the Environment Agency to tackle a lot of these issues. So in terms of overall, what's happened is a decade ago, we required water companies to start monitoring what was happening with storm overflows in particular. That is not complete. It will be complete by the end of this year, and that has unveiled the scandal, frankly, of how much sewage has been going into rivers through overflows, which were not designed to be used to that extent, but they have been designed to be used to stop sewage backing up into people's homes, principally. So there's a number of different ways that we are working locally and nationally. The Plan for Water came out earlier this year, which I launched, and a good example of that is a lot of what happens with parts of agriculture is that we get runoff from fields. That's then going into our water systems, and that's the sort of activity locally that we are doing also through the Environmental Management Scheme, but through regulation as well. There are farming rules of water, and there are now more powers available, as I say, to our regulators to help with that, and that's the kind of direct approach of what we can do, water body by water body, catchment by catchment, and that's recently I convened people to come together on the River Deben. There are many rivers in this constituency, but that's the way that we're trying to make sure we have this comprehensive approach around the country. And of course, water companies cannot get away with what they've been doing. That's why they are being held to account, and why we'll continue to do so.
Thank you. One more. We're right for one more question.
Could I just share some recent data on water testing locally? Thank you. So Darren referred to citizen science testing, which I think is really important in terms of monitoring the quality of the waters locally. And I've been working with some local campaigners who've been doing just that on a number of rivers in Suffolk and Norfolk in collaboration with the University of Suffolk. And just in the last 10 days, we've been testing around the Blythe, the Waveney, various points, including here in Halesworth, both for phosphates and for E. coli. And if I can share a visual, probably only those at the front will be able to see, but I will also describe it. It will show the levels of E. coli showing up in the Blythe, just here in Halesworth. And if it were to be within the recommended safe levels for swimming, which is the only metric we have, there would be no more than 9 blue dots on this grid. And if for those that can see in the room, it's 55 times that level in the Blythe here near Halesworth. We found in parts of Diss and Bungay between 10 and 20 times those legal limits. So, Thérèse rightly says this is a scandal, but it's one which DEFRA and the Secretary of State here is responsible for. And there are measures that can be taken both short term in terms of processing methods and medium term in terms of investment in the water infrastructure that the water companies need to be forced to do to achieve that. And the question I'd ask is, why is Anglian Water and other water companies being allowed to continue to allow their shareholders to take dividends? 555 million paid to dividends. Over the last decade. So when is the government going to get tougher on Anglian Water and make it clean up its act and say no more payments to shareholders until we stop this scandal that you rightly referred to?
So in the Environment Act 2020, Ofwat to Doncaster powers, those powers are being delivered. The regulations have gone through Parliament, and it's in Ofwat's hands to link the bonuses, the dividends, those other matters, there's now unlimited penalties. But to be very straightforward about this, I'm not surprised at this. One of the reasons, of course, why many people want to have designated bathing waters is that then more treatment happens at the water treatment works. So to do that, you end up using UV, high energy, in the system, also carbon intensive. In the river Seine in Paris, they use a chemical called PFA to do that with fluoric acid. That's what they do to treat some of their water in order to bring it to the designated levels for bathing water. Right now, Edmundsbury Water has been doing that experiment as a pilot in Southall at the water treatment. We saw the status of the bathing water go from sufficient to excellent as a consequence of that. But the Environment Agency is still not minded to allow that chemical to be used more widely across water treatment works. I would be keen if they did, but the other treatment would be the deployment of UV, or as I mentioned at the very start of this, a lot of this process will happen naturally through the sun and the radiation. I appreciate that's not what people want when they want to be able to swim anywhere, but those are the sorts of investments that will be happening in parts of Suffolk, and indeed the £60 billion now storm overflow discharge plan will be on the shoulders of water companies, and that will be regulated through the Environment Agency, the Environment Ofwat, and indeed the Department of the Environment.
Well, we're going to catch up then, aren't we? You're in charge of the Environment. We're going to catch up with everybody.
I'm going to draw, we've got one more question which I'm not going to ask because it's already 10 past or 11 past. I want to thank the panel for engaging with these questions. I want to thank you, the audience, for responding to that engagement in the variety of ways in which you've done so. And can we give the panel a huge round of applause? I think most of the panel will probably be around for refreshments, so if you've got questions you want to ask them, then please do engage with them and proceed to the refreshments.